Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to break down a really powerful framework for making smarter, more insightful comparisons. You know, it's something we do every single day, but have you ever stopped to think about how to do it well?
All right, so let's dive right in. First, we need to talk about a really common problem, something we all run into when we try to put two things side by side. It's what you might call the comparison trap.
You've heard it a million times, right? Don't compare apples and oranges. But let's be real, we do it all the time. The real question isn't if we compare them, but how we're actually doing it. Do we even have a process?
Yeah, and this is where it gets interesting. This quote from our source material really hits the nail on the head. It points out that even experts get more excited about the idea of comparing things, that's the adjective, comparative, than they do about having a solid method, the noun.
Okay, so how do we go from just messy, random comparisons to something a little more methodical? Well, here's the game plan. We'll start with that comparison trap, then introduce a new toolkit for thinking. We'll break that down into two parts, the setup and the process. And then we'll talk about why this whole thing even matters.
So what's the solution? Well, drawing from the work of scholars, the big idea here is to stop treating comparison like simple guesswork. Instead, we need to start seeing it for what it is, a systematic process that has its very own toolkit.
And here's how you should think about it. This isn't about going out and finding new facts or new data. Nope, it's what's called a second-order method, which is really just a way of saying it's a powerful tool for generating brand new insights from the information you already have. You're organizing what you already know to see it in a whole new light.
All right, let's open up this toolkit, shall we? Part 1 is all about the setup, and this is absolutely crucial. This is the planning stage you have to do before you even start comparing anything. It all comes down to making 4 key decisions.
First up, your goal. What are you actually trying to do here? Seriously, are you just trying to describe one thing in a new light by comparing it to something else? Or are you trying to do something bigger, like create a whole new category? This one choice is going to shape everything else you do.
Okay, next you've got to pick your mode. And this is great because it shows the difference between kind of lazy ways of comparing and the really productive ones. You know, just looking for what's similar or only what's different, that's a trap. Instead, the productive modes are either illuminative, where you use one thing to shed new light on another, or taxonomic, which is all about building or refining how we organize our knowledge.
After that, you've got to set your scale. And honestly, this map analogy is perfect. Think of it as the zoom level for your comparison. You absolutely have to compare things at the same level of detail. I mean, you wouldn't compare a single street in one city to an entire country on the other side of the world, right? It just doesn't make sense.
So, you can choose to work at the macro level, comparing huge things like entire religions or global economies. Or you can work at the meso level, looking at something more defined, like specific movements. Or you can get really granular at the micro level, zooming way in on individuals or specific texts. The key thing to remember is that your question has to match the scale you've picked.
And last but not least for our setup phase, you need to define your scope. Now this one's all about let's call it the distance between the things you're comparing. Is there a relationship between them or isn't there? How far apart are they really?
And this choice basically determines the kind of story you're going to uncover. Are you doing a relational comparison, where you're assuming there's some kind of historical connection, asking how did A affect B? Or are you doing an analogical comparison, where there's no real link and you're just asking, wow, how are these things similar even though they developed separately? See the difference? 2 totally different questions.
Okay, so the setup is done. We've made our 4 big decisions. Now let's get into part 2 and see how this all comes together in an active 5-step process. This is where the magic really happens.
Right, these 5 steps, these operations, they're basically the engine of this whole toolkit. They're going to guide you all the way from picking what to compare to, believe it or not, possibly generating a brand new theory about how the world works.
First up is selection. And honestly, you could argue this is the most critical step of them all. You're not just picking 2 items at random. You're also picking the tertium comparatinus. I know, it's a mouthful. It just means the third part of the comparison. It's the specific angle, the reason, the why behind your whole project.
Okay, so once you've selected your items and your angle, it's time for description. And I don't mean just a quick summary. We're talking about describing each item thoroughly, placing it in its rich historical and cultural context, and super important, you also need to bring in what other people have already said about it. And then, step 3, juxtaposition. This is it. This is the moment we've all been waiting for.
It's the core act of placing your items side by side and really digging in, analyzing both their similarities and their differences in a careful, systematic way. Now, this next part, this is where it gets really cool. After you've done that side-by-side analysis, you might just have that aha moment. That's step 4, redescription. It's when you look back at one of the things you started with and suddenly see it in a completely new way, all because of the comparison you just did.
And sometimes that aha moment snowballs into something even bigger. And that brings us to step 5, rectification. This is the real game changer. This is when you don't just see the item differently, you actually change the intellectual box you put it in. You're literally fixing or refining the very categories we all use to think about the world. How amazing is that?
Okay, so we've gone through the whole setup, the whole 5-step process, which might leave you wondering, what's the big payoff here? Why go through all this trouble instead of just, making casual comparisons like we always do?
Well, here's why it matters. A methodical approach like this one completely transforms comparison from just a simple and often kind of flawed observation into a powerful engine for real discovery. It helps us avoid sloppy thinking, prevents lazy generalizations, uncovers surprising connections, and ultimately, it helps us produce new, much more solid theories about the world.
And look, this whole framework, it isn't just for academics in an ivory tower. It's a tool that any of us can use to understand the world around us with so much more clarity and creativity. Which kind of leaves us with a final thought to chew on. Using this toolkit, how would you now compare something like, say, a social media network and a religion? What new things might you discover?